At my own backyard barbecue surrounded by 50 guests including my biggest business partners, my son crushed his sixth beer, pointed a shaking finger right at my chest and shouted, "He is not my father." The music seemed to stop. You could hear a pin drop on the stone patio. I did not yell. I did not throw him out. I just calmly wiped the barbecue sauce from my hands, pulled a sealed envelope from my shirt pocket and said, "That is strange because your mother left me this letter before she died, and it says something very different. Should I read it to the crowd right now?" His face drained of all its color. "My name is Darnell Crawford. I am 73 years old, and I spent 45 years building a commercial construction empire from the dirt up with my bare, calloused hands. Before I tell you how I dismantled my ungrateful son and his manipulative wife in front of their high society friends, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who built the table they are eating at. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon in late summer, the kind of day that was supposed to be a celebration. I was hosting our annual company barbecue at my estate, a sprawling property I bought decades ago when my knees were strong and my back did not ache every morning. The air was thick with the smell of hickory smoke and expensive cigars. The guest list was a mix of my oldest foreman bank executives and city zoning officials. My son Terrence, who is 45 and currently serving as the acting vice president of my company, was holding court near the pool. I say son, but Terrence is not my blood. I married his mother Vivian when he was just a toddler. I raised him. I paid for his expensive private schools. I gave him my last name. I handed him an executive title on a silver platter, hoping he would learn the value of hard work. Instead, he learned the value of a tailored suit and an unlimited corporate expense account. Standing right beside him was his wife, Chloe. Chloe is 40 years old, blonde, and holds a master's degree in passive-aggressive insults. She is the kind of woman who smiles with her teeth while her eyes constantly scan the room to see who is wearing a cheaper watch than her husband. From the moment they arrived, she had been treating me not like the host, but like the hired help. Darnell, she had said earlier, walking past me with a glass of champagne, make sure the catering staff keeps the ice buckets filled. And please do not talk to the regional bank manager about your days laying brick. Terrence is trying to secure a new credit line and we need to project a refined image. I just looked at her. A refined image. They were standing on my manicured lawn, drinking my imported liquor, trying to impress bankers who only took the meeting because my name was on the building. But I kept my mouth shut. I have always been a quiet man. I observe. I let people show me exactly who they are before I make a move. As the afternoon dragged on, Terrence kept drinking. By his fourth beer, he was getting loud. By his fifth, he was taking sole credit for the new downtown high-rise project, a deal I had negotiated personally while he was on a golf trip. By his sixth beer, the liquid courage completely washed away his fake corporate charm, leaving nothing but his raw, unfiltered arrogance. He stood up on the edge of the patio, tapping his fork against a glass to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down. People turned toward him expecting a toast to the company, or maybe a tribute to me, the founder. I want to thank you all for coming out to celebrate the new era of Crawford construction. Terrence announced his words, slurring just enough to make the bank executives exchange nervous glances. We are moving away from the old, outdated ways of doing things. We are modernizing. We are leaving the blue-collar mentality in the dust where it belongs. I was standing by the grill holding a pair of tongs, watching the boy I raised completely disrespect the blood, sweat, and tears that paid for his luxury cars. One of my oldest foremen, an honest man named Marcus who had been with me for 30 years, frowned and spoke up. "Terrence, you would not have a new era if Darnell had not broken his back pouring the concrete for the foundation of this company." Terrence scoffed. He waved his hand dismissively in my direction, his eyes filled with a disgust that chilled me to the bone. "Look at him," Terrence sneered, his voice echoing across the silent yard. "The old man thinks he still runs things. News flash for everyone here. He is not my father. He just married my mother. He is just a retired bricklayer who got lucky. I am the real brains of this operation." The silence that followed was suffocating. 50 people held their breath. A woman near the pool gasped. Someone accidentally dropped a glass and the shattering sound made everyone flinch. Chloe stood next to him, not looking horrified, but looking slightly embarrassed that her husband was making a scene. She did not correct him. She did not tell him to respect the man who paid for her designer shoes. She just took a sip of her drink and looked away. 45 years of my life flashed before my eyes. I remembered staying up late at the kitchen table doing math on a notepad to make sure we could afford Terrence college tuition. I remembered visiting him in the hospital when he broke his arm, holding his hand while he cried. I remembered Vivian, my beautiful late wife, begging me on her deathbed to look out for him because she knew how weak and easily manipulated he truly was. I did not feel angry. Anger is hot and messy. What I felt was a freezing, absolute clarity. The boy I raised was dead, and the man standing in front of me was a parasite. I placed the tongs down on the grill. I grabbed a cloth napkin and slowly, methodically wiped the barbecue sauce from my fingers. Every eye in the yard was fixed on me. They expected me to yell. They expected a massive blowout. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my linen shirt and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. I walked toward the center of the patio. My footsteps were the only sound in the yard. I stopped a few feet away from Terrence, who was suddenly looking a lot less confident. "That is strange, Terrence," I said, my voice low but carrying a heavy, dangerous weight. "Because your mother left me this letter before she died, and it says something very different." Terrence stared at the envelope. His arrogant smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. I tapped the envelope against my palm. "Vivian was a smart woman. She knew exactly what you were becoming. She wrote down every detail about your real origins, your habits, and your secret little financial hobbies. Should I read it to the crowd right now? Let everyone know who the real brains of the operation is." His face completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He knew I knew. Suddenly, Chloe leaped into action. Her survival instincts kicked in. She rushed forward, forcing a horribly fake, sweet smile onto her face, trying to play the part of the concerned daughter-in-law. "Oh my goodness, listen to him." Chloe laughed nervously, waving her hands at the guests. "Darnell is just confused. The heat must be getting to him. His mind has been slipping so much lately. Bless his heart, he is getting everything all mixed up." She reached out, her manicured fingers diving like vulture claws, trying to snatch the envelope right out of my hand. "Give me that silly paper, sweetie," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Let us get you inside before you embarrass yourself any further." I did not flinch. I simply stepped back, letting her hand grasp empty air. I looked her dead in the eyes, stripping away the kindly grandfather facade I had worn for years. "Do not strain yourself, Chloe," I said, smiling a smile that made her physically take a step backward. "You do not need to take my copy. You can just read it on your phone." She blinked, confused and suddenly terrified. "What do you mean?" I turned my gaze back to Terrence, making sure the bank executives and the zoning officials heard every single word. "I mean, I emailed a certified digitized copy of this exact letter, along with 20 pages of financial irregularities to the entire board of directors at 8 o'clock this morning," I announced. The chaos was instantaneous. The bank executive from the corner table immediately pulled out his phone, his face turning pale as he checked his inbox. Whispers erupted across the patio like wildfire. Guests began to awkwardly gather their coats and purses, sensing that the Crawford Empire was about to experience a bloody civil war. Terrence stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, the empty beer bottle slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the stone floor. Chloe looked like she was about to faint, her eyes darting frantically around the yard as she realized her high society image was burning to ashes right in front of her. I did not stay to watch them panic. I simply turned around, walked into my massive house, and locked the glass door behind me. The barbecue was officially over, but my revenge had only just begun. I walked away from the patio and did not look back. The heavy glass door slid shut behind me, completely cutting off the frantic whispers of the guests and the panicked breathing of the boy I had raised. I walked through the grand foyer of my home. My boots echoed loudly on the polished hardwood floors. The house was massive, quiet, and suddenly felt very cold. I made my way down the long hallway toward my private study. I stepped inside the room and turned the heavy brass lock on the door. The solid click of the mechanism felt like a hard boundary being drawn between my past and my future. I walked over to my desk. It was a massive piece of solid oak that I had built myself 30 years ago. I sat down in my leather chair and let the absolute silence of the room wash over me. On the corner of my desk sat a framed photograph. It was an old faded picture of my late wife Vivian and me holding a chubby toddler. That toddler was Terrence. He was 2 years old in that photo, wearing a pair of denim overalls I had bought him with my very first real paycheck from the construction site. He had just pointed at me at the barbecue and told 50 important people that I was not his father. He thought that was a weapon. He thought that was a dark secret he could use to humiliate and destroy me. But I already knew the truth. I knew it 45 years ago. Vivian came to me broken, terrified, and carrying another man-child. A man who had promised her the world and then vanished into thin air the moment she told him she was pregnant. I did not care about bloodlines back then. I loved her, and I chose to love her son. I put my name on his birth certificate. I worked 16-hour shifts pouring concrete in the blistering summer heat just so he could go to the best private schools in the state. I built an entire commercial real estate empire so that boy would never have to know the bitter struggle I knew. I gave him everything a father could give. And in return, he looked at my black calloused hands and felt nothing but shame. He desperately wanted the wealth, but he despised the man who actually built it. I let out a slow breath and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I reached my hand all the way to the back, feeling for the false wooden panel. I pressed the hidden latch and the panel popped open. This was the secret compartment where I kept the spare set of keys to the wall safe hidden behind my bookshelf. My fingers brushed against the soft felt lining of the small space. It was completely empty. I froze in my chair. I ran my hand over every inch of the hidden compartment. Nothing. The heavy brass keys were gone. A cold, sharp realization crept up my spine. They were not just planning to push me out of the company with public humiliation. They were already inside my fortress. I did not panic. I am a man who measures twice and cuts once. 6 months ago, I started noticing small, strange discrepancies in the company ledgers. Just tiny numbers shifting in the accounting software. So I quietly hired a private security firm to install hidden cameras in my home. The lenses were perfectly disguised inside the smoke detectors and bookshelf ornaments. Terrence and Chloe thought I was just a senile old bricklayer who could barely operate a smartphone. They had no idea I was watching their every single move. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the encrypted security application. I scrolled back through the timeline, navigating to the previous night. The house had been dark. I was fast asleep upstairs. At 2 a.m, the camera captured movement. The heavy oak door of my study slowly creaked open. There they were, Terrence and Chloe creeping into my private sanctuary like common thieves in the night. The night vision camera cast a pale green glow over their faces. Chloe was standing by the door, acting as the lookout. Her face was twisted in a look of absolute disgust as she scanned my personal belongings. She wiped her hands on her expensive silk pajamas as if simply being in my office was contaminating her high society skin. Terrence was sweating profusely. He moved straight to my desk. He did not even hesitate. He knew exactly how to pick the simple lock on the bottom drawer. It was a trick I had taught him when he was 12 years old, so he could get his baseball cards back after being grounded. He was using the very lessons I taught him to betray me. He found the false panel. He pulled out the spare keys. Then he moved directly to my desktop computer. He plugged a silver flash drive into the side of the machine. I zoomed in on the screen of my phone. My heart turned to pure ice. He was not just looking at old files. He was downloading the entire corporate server. He was copying the master financial database, the private client registry, the upcoming bid proposals, and the internal payroll accounts. Everything I had built over 4 long decades was being siphoned into his pocket in the dead of night. I watched the footage as Chloe whispered something to him. She pointed impatiently at the computer monitor, urging him to hurry up. Terrence nodded, his hands trembling violently as he typed in the administrative bypass codes. He looked pathetic. A 45-year-old man stealing from the father who gave him the world, all to impress a woman who only loved the numbers in his bank account. They finished the digital download, carefully locked the drawer back up, and sneaked out of the room. They left no physical trace behind. They truly thought they were clever. They thought they had outsmarted the old man. I turned off the video feed and set my phone down on the smooth wooden surface of the desk. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. They were actively preparing to strip the company bare and leave me with nothing but memories. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling, calculating my next move with absolute precision. I needed to call Vincent, my lead attorney, and initiate a total lockdown of the corporate assets. I needed to crush their little rebellion before it could spread any further. But before I could even reach for the phone to make the call, the screen lit up brightly. A sharp, loud chime broke the heavy silence of the office. It was an automated, high-priority email alert. I picked up the device and opened the message. It was an urgent notification from the private wealth management division of my bank. The words on the screen made my blood boil with a rage I had not felt in years. It was a fraud alert. An unauthorized user had just attempted to initiate a wire transfer of $200,000. But the money was not being taken from my personal checking account. It was an attempted withdrawal from the irrevocable trust fund I had set up in memory of Vivian. Her sacred fund meant entirely for children charities was being raided. The notification showed the exact location and device of the attempted wire transfer. It was initiated from a mobile phone registered to Chloe. They were not even waiting for the dust to settle from the barbecue. They were moving in for the kill right this very second. I did not throw my phone across the room. I did not scream into the empty house. I simply pressed a single button on my screen and called my lawyer Vincent. Vincent is not the kind of attorney you call when you want to settle a family dispute over a cup of coffee. He is a predator in a custom-tailored suit. He is the kind of man you call when you want to absolutely legally erase a problem from existence. When he answered on the second ring, I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to lock down Vivian's trust fund immediately and to get over to my house. I told him Terrence had breached my study and was actively pulling data from the corporate server. Vincent does not ask unnecessary questions. Within 30 minutes, his black sedan pulled up my driveway. He walked into my study, his face completely devoid of emotion, and opened his laptop on my desk. He bypassed the simple encryptions Terrence thought were so incredibly clever. Vincent started running a complete forensic trace on the main servers, tracking every single digital footprint my ungrateful son had left behind over the past year. At first glance, the company ledgers looked perfectly normal. There were payments to concrete suppliers, equipment leasing companies, and independent contractors. But Vincent knows exactly how to look beneath the floorboards. He ran a matching algorithm and found a series of ghost transactions hidden deep within the accounts payable. They were small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Then the numbers started getting dangerously big. 50,000, 100,000. All cleverly disguised as structural consulting fees and material acquisitions. But the money was not going to our regular vendors. It was being funneled directly into a newly formed, limited liability company. I stared at the glowing screen as Vincent pulled up the state registration documents for the Shell Corporation. The registered owner of the LLC was a man named Richard Sterling. Hearing that name after 45 long years felt like a ghost walking right through the thick walls of my study. I knew exactly who Richard Sterling was. He was the man who left my beautiful Vivian crying in a cheap motel room when she told him she was pregnant. Richard was a smooth-talking man who spent his entire life pretending to be old-money aristocracy. He wore imported tweed suits, smoked ridiculously expensive cigars, and spoke with an affected accent he probably practiced in front of a mirror. To the untrained eye, he looked like a wealthy socialite. To anyone who actually knew how the world worked, he was a cheap hustler. He was a con artist who preyed on vulnerable women and gullible investors. He had vanished before Terrence took his very first breath. And now, decades later, the rat had crawled back out of the sewers. Vincent dug deeper into the public records and social media archives. He found photographs. There was Terrence having a lavish lunch with Richard at an exclusive all-white country club. There was Chloe smiling brightly next to Richard at a charity gala, looking at him like he was royalty. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The sudden disrespect, the sneering at my blue-collar background, the comment at the barbecue about leaving the old ways in the dust. Terrence had found his biological father, or rather the con artist had smelled money and found his wealthy, easily manipulated son. Terrence thought Richard was his golden ticket into true generational high society. He thought this man with his fake accent and empty pockets was infinitely better than the black man who poured concrete for 16 hours a day to put food on his table. Chloe, with her obsession for status and her hidden racial prejudice, had probably encouraged the entire reunion. They both thought Richard was a sophisticated aristocrat. They had no idea they were funding a broke grifter. Terrence was systematically funneling my hard-earned money into the hands of the very coward who had abandoned him in the womb. I felt a bitter, hollow laugh rumbling deep in my chest. Terrence was trading a real, tangible empire for a plastic crown. He was stealing from the man who gave him everything to buy the affection of a man who gave him nothing. Vincent looked up from his screen. His eyes were cold and calculating. He asked me what I wanted to do. He told me he could freeze all of Terrence's accounts right now and have the police waiting at his front door by morning. I shook my head. I told Vincent to let the trap stay open. I wanted to see exactly how far my son and his wife were willing to go before I snapped it shut on their necks. I told Vincent to prepare the corporate execution documents in secret. We were going to completely strip Terrence of his title, his shares, and his dignity. But I wanted everything airtight. I wanted absolutely no room for legal maneuvering. Vincent nodded, packed up his computer, and left me alone in the silent house. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon and sat by the large window watching the sun begin to rise over the estate I had built from nothing. I thought the worst of their betrayal had been uncovered for the night. I was completely wrong. The real attack came at exactly 9 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen drinking a cup of black coffee when the heavy doorbell rang. I walked to the foyer and opened the door. Standing on my porch was not a friendly neighbor or a delivery driver. It was a court process server. He asked if I was Darnell Crawford. I nodded. He handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope, turned around, and walked away without saying another word. I took the envelope back to my study. I sliced it open with a brass letter opener and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I read the very first page and the air completely left my lungs. It was an emergency court summons. Chloe and Terrence were not just trying to steal my money or push me out of the company. They had officially filed a petition in the state court for full medical and financial conservatorship over me. They were dragging me before a judge to declare me mentally incompetent. I sat down and read the sworn affidavits attached to the petition. The lies were staggering. Terrence claimed under oath that I was suffering from severe paranoia and early onset dementia. He wrote that I was hoarding money, making irrational business decisions, and aggressively threatening family members without cause. Chloe submitted a separate statement claiming I was a physical danger to myself and others. They even included the incident at the barbecue, twisting the narrative to say I had completely hallucinated a letter from my dead wife in a fit of psychotic rage. They claimed I was wandering the yard, shouting at guests, and ruining the corporate image due to my failing mind. They were using my calm, calculated reaction against me. They wanted a judge to legally strip away my human rights, hand them the absolute keys to my entire estate, and lock me away in a medical facility while they spent my fortune with Richard Sterling. They thought they had backed an old man into a corner. They thought a piece of paper and a few creative lies could erase 45 years of ruthless business survival. They thought I would crumble under the weight of the legal system. I did not panic. I did not feel fear. I simply picked up my phone and called Vincent for the second time. The game was no longer just about the company or the money. It was about my absolute freedom and my life. They had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. I knew that if Chloe and Terrence wanted to play a dirty game of legal chess, I had to let them think they were winning. They had petitioned the court for medical conservatorship, claiming I was losing my mind and becoming a danger to the company. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I confined myself to the master bedroom on the first floor. I drew the heavy blackout curtains, kept the lights dim, and dressed in an oversized, faded robe. When you spend 45 years surviving in the cutthroat commercial construction industry, a world where a black man has to work 10 times as hard just to get a seat at the table, you learn a thing or two about strategy. The greatest advantage a man can ever have is being completely underestimated by his enemies. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Chloe finally made her move. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her designer heels echoing down the hardwood hallway long before she pushed open my bedroom door. She walked in holding a silver thermos and a thick leather clipboard. Her face was twisted into an exaggerated, sickly sweet smile that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Darnell," she cooed, using that high-pitched, condescending tone people usually reserve for toddlers or stray pets. "Look at you sitting all alone in the dark. I brought you some homemade chicken soup to build up your strength." She set the thermos on the bedside table and poured a thick, cloudy liquid into a porcelain bowl. I have spent my whole life trusting my gut, and right then my gut was screaming. The soup did not smell like normal chicken broth. It had a faint, chalky, bitter chemical odor completely masking the herbs. I knew instantly that my dear calculating daughter-in-law had laced it with mild sedatives to keep me docile and compliant. I coughed a deep, rattling, entirely fake cough and let my shoulders slump forward, playing the part of the broken old man perfectly. "Thank you, Chloe," I wheezed, making my voice sound incredibly thin and brittle. "You are too kind to an old man." Her smile widened. She truly thought she had me completely fooled. She handed me the bowl of soup and then quickly slid the leather clipboard onto my lap. "Now, Darnell," she said smoothly, lightly touching my shoulder with a fake display of affection. "Terrence and I found a wonderful new private doctor who specializes in senior cognitive care. He is going to come to the house tomorrow and give you a full checkup so you do not even have to leave your bed. But the medical board requires your signature on this standard consent form before he can legally evaluate you. Just sign right there at the bottom, and then you can eat your nice warm soup and take a long nap." She handed me a heavy gold pen. I looked down at the clipboard. The document was covered in dense, tiny legal print deliberately formatted to be unreadable to failing eyes. But my eyes were not failing. I stared at the paper, and then I let my hands begin to shake. It was not a genuine tremor. It was a perfectly executed, Oscar-worthy performance. My fingers vibrated violently, tapping the heavy gold pen against the leather clipboard. "Oh my goodness, my hands," I mumbled, acting deeply distressed and confused. "I am so sorry, Chloe. I just feel so incredibly weak today. Let me take a sip of this soup first to steady my nerves." Before she could reach out to stop me, I grabbed the porcelain bowl with both shaking hands. I lifted it unsteadily, bringing it dangerously close to the documents. Then, with a calculated, deliberate twitch of my wrist, I tipped the entire bowl forward. The hot, cloudy, sedative-laced liquid splashed directly onto the clipboard, instantly soaking the paper. The thick soup ruined the document, smearing the ink and turning the pages into a soggy, unreadable mess. Chloe let out a genuine, piercing shriek of pure frustration. "What are you doing, you clumsy old fool?" she yelled, completely dropping her sweet, caring daughter-in-law facade in a split second. She lunged forward frantically, trying to wipe the soup off the document with her bare, manicured hands. But she was far too late. The top paper was destroyed. However, the hot liquid had made the top sheet translucent, revealing the bold, capitalized print on the second page underneath. I did not need my reading glasses to see what it said. It was not a medical consent form. The heavy black letters clearly read deed of transfer, and right below that heading was the exact address of my commercial high-rise in the downtown district. It was a flagship property I had built from the ground up, currently valued at over $3 million. She was actively trying to trick me into signing away my prime real estate under the guise of a medical evaluation. I slumped back against the pillows, pretending to look utterly terrified of her sudden outburst. "I am so sorry, Chloe," I whimpered, making my hands shake even harder. My hands just gave out. "I am so clumsy." She glared at me, her chest heaving with pure, unfiltered rage. Her hands were covered in sticky warm soup, and the multi-million-dollar theft she had so carefully planned was completely ruined. "Do not worry about it," she hissed through gritted teeth, her blue eyes filled with absolute venom. "I will go to the home office and print fresh copies. Just stay right here and do not move a single muscle." She snatched the ruined clipboard, turned on her heels, and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. The very moment the latch clicked into place, my trembling completely stopped. My posture straightened up. The frail old man vanished, replaced by the ruthless businessman who built an empire. I threw the covers off, walked into the adjoining bathroom, and poured the remaining drops of the laced soup from the thermos into a small plastic vial I had prepared earlier in my pocket. Vincent and his private investigator would have an absolute field day running a toxicology screen on that specific sample. Attempting to drug a senior citizen to steal real estate was a serious felony, and I was collecting every piece of ammunition I could carry. I spent the rest of the evening sitting in the dark, waiting. I knew their timeline was accelerating rapidly. They were getting desperate, taking sloppy risks and leaving behind a trail of evidence. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. The massive house was dead silent. Suddenly, there was a soft, rhythmic tapping on my ground-floor bedroom window. I walked over silently and parted the heavy curtains just a fraction of an inch. Standing in the cold night air, looking terrified and constantly glancing over her shoulder, was Maya. She is Terrence and Chloe, 19-year-old daughter, a brilliant college student, and the only person in that entire toxic household who actually possessed a functioning moral compass. I unlocked the latch and pushed the glass window open. She climbed inside, quickly shivering, clutching a thick manila folder tightly to her chest. Maya did not look at me with the fake pity her parents used. She looked at me with an urgency and a fierce loyalty that mirrored my own. She knew I was not losing my mind. She had always seen right through her parents' manipulative illusions and racist microaggressions. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice trembling but full of absolute determination. I was using my mom laptop for a college assignment when her encrypted email notifications popped up on the screen. "I found out exactly what they are planning to do to you tomorrow." She handed me the manila folder. I opened it under the dim yellow light of my bedside lamp. It was a printed receipt and an email chain from an underground black market medical network. It confirmed a wire transfer of $10,000 sent from Chloe's private account. I looked up at my granddaughter, the only true family I felt I had left in the world. Maya swallowed hard, tears pooling in her young eyes as she delivered the final crushing blow. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice breaking in the quiet room. "My mom just bought a fake Alzheimer diagnosis online. The official doctor signed papers arrive tomorrow morning and they are bringing men to take you away." The morning after my granddaughter Maya climbed through my bedroom window and handed me the evidence of her mother purchasing a fake medical diagnosis, I expected a team of men in white coats to arrive at my door. Instead, my ungrateful son and his calculating wife changed their tactics. Perhaps they realized that dragging a wealthy, coherent man out of his own estate by force would raise too many red flags. They needed a public spectacle. They needed witnesses to testify that I had completely lost my mind. So they invited me to lunch at the Oakbridge Country Club under the guise of signing some routine vendor contracts for the construction business. Oakbridge is not just a golf course. It is an exclusive generational wealth fortress. It is the kind of establishment where the initiation fee costs more than a suburban home, and the only black people you ever see on the premises are carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres or parking imported luxury vehicles. Terrence and Chloe deliberately chose this location to pull me completely out of my element. They wanted me to feel small, intimidated, and entirely surrounded by their world. They wanted to provoke the angry, unhinged stereotype in front of 50 wealthy patrons so they could comfortably justify locking me away in a facility. I decided to give them exactly the performance they paid for. I did not wear my custom-tailored suits. I dug an old, oversized, slightly moth-eaten blazer out of the back of my closet. I purposely mismatched my socks. When we arrived at the club, I did not walk with the straight, commanding posture of a man who built a commercial real estate empire. I shuffled my feet. I kept my head down. I let my hands tremble slightly as I navigated the grand marble foyer. I played the part of a confused, broken elder to absolute perfection. Chloe guided me to a table right in the center of the main dining room, ensuring we were the focal point of the afternoon crowd. Sitting at the table were three of her closest friends. They were wealthy, idle socialites dripping in designer jewelry, the kind of women who spend their days drinking mimosas and measuring the worth of other human beings by their zip codes. When I sat down, they looked at me not as a person, but as a tragic museum exhibit. The microaggressions began before the waiter even poured our water. One of the women leaned across the table and spoke to me very slowly and incredibly loudly, as if I were deaf or entirely incapable of understanding the English language. She asked me how I was enjoying my retirement and if I missed getting my hands dirty in the mud. Chloe let out a patronizing little laugh and told her friends that Darnell gets easily overwhelmed by big words these days, bless his heart. Another woman chimed in, joking that I probably preferred tap water over the imported sparkling water the waiter was offering. They were actively poking the bear, waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to raise my voice and cause a scene that would permanently ruin my reputation. Terrence sat at the head of the table, swirling a very expensive glass of scotch, grinning like a king holding court. He was entirely complicit in the disrespect of the man who literally put the food on his plate. He wanted to see me broken. But I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I simply let my jaw hang slightly open and blinked very slowly, acting as if I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. When the lunch arrived, I let my hand shake violently as I picked up my soup spoon. I deliberately spilled a few drops of broth onto the crisp white tablecloth. Chloe sighed loudly and rolled her eyes for the entire dining room to witness. "Look at him," she whispered loudly to the women, making sure her voice carried to the neighboring tables. "He is completely gone. It is so incredibly tragic to see him degrade like this." I sat there in silence, listening to these people belittle me. I thought about how I used to sit across from ruthless bank executives and union bosses negotiating multi-million-dollar high-rise developments without breaking a sweat. And now I was letting a table of arrogant snobs treat me like an invalid. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed to maintain my blank, senile expression, but I knew the reward would be worth the temporary humiliation. After the plates were cleared away, Terrence finally made his move. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his designer leather briefcase and slid them across the polished wood table toward me. He spoke in a soothing, overly exaggerated tone like a teacher talking to a slow child. "Now, Dad," he said smoothly, "these are just some routine renewal contracts for the concrete suppliers. You just need to sign the bottom line so I can get them filed with the city this afternoon." He handed me a heavy silver fountain pen, But I did not even need to read the fine print to know what he was doing. I noticed the slight difference in the paperweight and the way he carefully kept his hand resting over the top edge of the pages to obscure the headings. He had slipped the commercial real estate transfer deeds right into the middle of the stack. These were the exact same documents Chloe had tried to trick me into signing the day before with the laced soup. They were desperate. They needed my legal signature to transfer my $3 million downtown property into their names before their fake Alzheimer's diagnosis was officially filed with the state court. I picked up the silver pen. I let my hand shake so badly that the pen tapped against the table. I looked up at Terrence with wide, vacant eyes. "Where do I sign Tommy?" I asked, intentionally using the wrong name to really sell the dementia act. Chloe snickered behind her hand, exchanging a victorious look with her friends. Terrence smiled a greedy, triumphant smile and tapped his finger on the dotted line at the bottom of the page. "Right here," he said gently. "Just write your name nice and clear for me." I pressed the tip of the pen to the heavy paper. I did not write Darnell Crawford. I kept my hand moving in a slow, jagged cursive. I wrote the word idiot. Then I moved to the next signature line on the following page and wrote, "You fool." I signed all 5 pages with variations of those insults. I kept my head bowed, acting like a confused old man concentrating intensely on a very difficult physical task. Terrence was already looking away, signaling the waiter to bring the check, completely and utterly confident that his master plan had worked flawlessly. When I finished my signatures, I neatly stacked the papers and pulled them slightly toward my chest, clutching them tightly. I looked up at Chloe and blinked rapidly. "Excuse me," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly frail and weak. "I need to use the restroom. Could you point me in the right direction?" Chloe waved her hand dismissively toward the back hallway. "Go ahead," she sighed, looking deeply annoyed by my mere existence. "Just do not get lost on your way back." I slowly stood up, keeping the entire stack of documents pressed against my chest like a security blanket. Terrence did not even notice I had taken the papers with me. He was too busy toasting his own fabricated success with his high society friends, celebrating a victory he had not actually won. I shuffled slowly toward the hallway until I was completely out of their line of sight. The very moment I turned the corner and the dining room vanished from view, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands ceased instantly. The confused, broken old man evaporated, and the titan of commercial construction returned. I tucked the stack of insulted documents into the inner pocket of my oversized blazer. I did not go to the restroom. I walked straight out the side exit of the country club, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun. I walked across the parking lot and got directly into the black town car my lawyer Vincent had waiting for me with the engine running. We drove away, leaving my ungrateful son waiting at an expensive table for a signature he would never receive. I returned to my estate from the country club feeling a profound sense of clarity. The massive house was completely silent. I walked into my study, took off the oversized, moth-eaten blazer I had worn for my performance, and threw it into the trash can. I put on a clean, crisp linen shirt and sat behind my heavy oak desk. I knew the storm was coming. I knew Terrence and Chloe would soon realize I had walked out with their fraudulent transfer deeds, but I did not expect the devil himself to knock on my front door. Less than an hour after I got home, the security buzzer at my front gate chimed. I checked the camera feed on my monitor. Standing there, leaning against the intercom speaker with an unbearable aura of arrogance, was a man I had not seen in person for 45 years. It was Richard Sterling, Terrence's biological father. The man who had abandoned my late wife Vivian when she was young, terrified, and pregnant. I pressed the button to open the iron gates. I wanted to look this man directly in the eyes. A few minutes later, my heavy front door echoed with a loud, confident knock. I walked to the foyer and pulled the door open. Richard stepped inside without even waiting for an invitation. He looked exactly like the kind of man who spends his entire life trying to convince strangers he is wealthy. He wore a tailored light gray suit that was just a little too flashy. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine and his hair was slicked back flawlessly. He held an unlit, thick Cuban cigar between his fingers. He looked around my grand foyer, taking in the crystal chandelier and the marble floors, a greedy smile spreading across his face. "Nice place you have here, Darnell," he said, his voice dripping with a fake upper-class accent. "I have to admit you did quite well for a guy who used to carry bags of cement for a living." I did not offer him a handshake. I did not ask him to take off his shoes. I simply turned around and walked back toward my study, leaving him to follow me like a stray dog following the scent of meat. He stepped into my office and immediately made himself at home. He sat down in the leather guest chair opposite my desk, crossed one leg over the other, and finally struck a match to light his cigar. The thick, pungent smell of tobacco smoke quickly filled my pristine office. I did not tell him to put it out. I just sat behind my desk, watching him carefully. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to look like a commanding presence. "Look, Darnell let us skip the pleasantries," he said smoothly, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. "You and I both know why I am here. Terrence and I have reconnected. We have bonded. Blood calls to blood, you know how it is. You did a decent job babysitting my boy. You paid for his schools, you gave him a nice little job at your company, and I am sure Vivian appreciated the financial support. But the adults are talking now." I remained completely silent. I rested my hands on my desk, my face carved from stone. I wanted to hear every single word this parasite had to say. "Terrence belongs in my world now." Richard continued, gesturing vaguely with his cigar. "He is meant for high society, not the blue-collar dirt you come from. But I understand you are getting old. Your mind is slipping. Terrence told me all about your little episodes, so I am here to offer you a gentleman agreement. You are going to obediently hand over the company to my flesh and blood. You sign over the voting rights, transfer the commercial assets to Terrence, and step down quietly. If you do that, I will personally make sure they put you in a very nice, comfortable nursing home where you can live out your final days without any stress." He leaned back in the chair, taking another puff of his cigar, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He truly believed he was intimidating me. He thought he was a lion walking into a sheep pen. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked directly into a slaughterhouse. I did not yell. I did not curse at him. I stood up slowly from my chair and walked over to the antique Globe bar cart sitting in the corner of my study. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured myself a neat glass of 20-year-old bourbon. The sound of the amber liquid splashing against the glass was the only noise in the room. I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in my chest. Then I walked back to my desk. I did not sit down. I reached into my top drawer and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder that my lawyer Vincent had delivered to me earlier that morning. I tossed it onto the center of my desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud right in front of Richard. "I strongly suggest you put the cigar down and read that, Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but laced with a cold, terrifying authority. Richard frowned, losing a fraction of his smug confidence. He placed his cigar in the crystal ashtray on my desk and picked up the folder. He flipped it open. The very first document inside was a highly detailed certified public record. It was a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing submitted in the state of Delaware just 3 months ago. The name on the filing was Richard Sterling. The document listed 0 liquid assets, multiple foreclosed properties, and a mountain of unpaid civil judgments. I watched as the color began to drain from his face. His eyes darted quickly across the pages, but I was not finished. "Turn to the next page," I commanded. Richard swallowed hard. His fingers were suddenly trembling as he turned the thick paper. The second document was not public record. It was an internal, highly classified report that my private security team had to pull massive favors to acquire. It was an active undercover arrest warrant issued by the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. It detailed massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and the operation of illegal shell companies. It clearly stated that federal agents were actively building a racketeering case against him. "You came into my house to talk about high society," I said smoothly, taking another sip of my bourbon. "You came into my house to talk about bloodlines. You do not have a world for Terrence to join Richard. You do not have a dime to your name. You are a broke, desperate, wanted fugitive trying to use my idiot son as a human shield to pay off your criminal debts. You are not a king. You are a rat fleeing a sinking ship." Richard stared at the federal warrant. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The fake aristocratic confidence completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, sweating old man facing federal prison. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic. He knew I had the power to send this entire folder directly to the federal agents waiting for him. But rats are dangerous when they are backed into a corner. Richard closed the folder. His hands were shaking violently, but a desperate, ugly smirk slowly crawled back onto his face. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on my desk. "You think you have me beat, Darnell?" he sneered, his voice cracking with panic. "You think you are so smart? But you do not know the whole story. You do not know what your golden boy has already done. I narrowed my eyes, setting my bourbon glass down on the desk. You can hand me over to the feds, Richard continued, his voice rising in a frantic pitch. But if I go down, Terrence goes down with me. Last week, I needed a massive injection of capital to keep my creditors off my back. So I took out a $1 million private loan. And guess who co-signed as the primary guarantor? Guess who pledged his personal assets and his corporate shares to secure the bag? He pointed a shaking finger right at my face. Your precious son, he spat. Terrence signed the paperwork. He used your company credentials to back my debt. If I default on that loan, if the IRS freezes my accounts and throws me in a cell, those creditors are coming directly for Terrence. They will tear his life apart. They will take his house, his cars, and his freedom. If you do not save me, Darnell, your son is going to federal prison. The room fell dead silent. The smell of the dying cigar hung heavy in the air. Richard stood there panting, believing he had just played an unbeatable trump card. He thought my love for the boy I raised would force me to cover his $1 million debt and let him walk away scot-free. He thought he had trapped me. I looked at this pathetic, desperate man. I thought about the sheer staggering stupidity of Terrence signing away his life for a man who had never done a single thing for him. Terrence had willingly tied his own neck to a sinking anchor. He had betrayed me, stolen from me, and tried to declare me insane, all to fund the lifestyle of a criminal. I looked Richard dead in the eyes, my expression completely unchanged, as the absolute finality of the situation settled into my bones. I left Richard standing in the middle of my study, completely convinced he held my entire world in his greedy hands. He truly thought the threat of my son going to federal prison would break me. He thought I would simply open my checkbook and blindly pay off his $1 million debt just to save the boy I raised from the consequences of his own staggering stupidity. I did not scream at him. I did not throw him out by his collar. I simply walked past his smug face, went straight out to my garage, and got into my car. I drove away, leaving that parasite standing in the middle of a grand estate he could never afford to build in 10 lifetimes. I drove straight into the heart of the city, heading to the towering glass and steel building where my attorney operated. Vincent has a corner office on the 50th floor. It is a room constructed of cold marble, dark leather, and heavy soundproof glass. It is not a place for friendly chats or family reconciliations. It is a room where corporate empires are dismantled and generational legacies are secured with ruthless precision. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors, Vincent was already waiting for me behind his massive desk. He knew exactly why I was there. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite him and breathed in the cool, sterile air of the room. I told him about the visit from Richard. I told him about the $1 million private loan Terrence had co-signed using my corporate credentials as collateral. Vincent did not blink. His expression remained entirely unchanged. He just nodded slowly, absorbing the information like a supercomputer processing a new set of variables. Then he stood up, walked over to a heavy steel safe bolted securely into the concrete wall behind his desk, and turned the mechanical combination dial. He reached inside and pulled out a worn, dark mahogany lockbox. It was the only item in that sterile modern office that looked like it actually had a soul. I recognized it immediately, and a sudden tightness gripped my chest. It belonged to my late wife, Vivian. Before she passed away 3 years ago, she spent countless hours sitting in this exact office with Vincent, quietly and methodically arranging her affairs. Vivian was an incredibly loving woman, but she was not blind. She loved her son deeply, but she knew exactly how weak his spine was. She saw the way Chloe looked at our house, our cars, and our bank accounts with a hungry, entitled glare. She saw the subtle, deeply ingrained racism in the friends Chloe brought around, the quiet microaggressions, the condescending smiles, and the way Chloe silently encouraged it all. Vivian knew that once she was gone and buried in the ground, Chloe would dig her venomous claws deep into Terrence and try to bleed my empire dry. She knew Terrence would never have the strength to stand up to a woman who made him feel like he was part of an elite society he desperately wanted to belong to. Vincent placed the mahogany box on the smooth surface of the desk and unlocked it with a small brass key. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents tied together with a simple red ribbon. He looked at me with a rare, genuine expression of absolute respect. Vincent told me that Vivian was the most brilliantly ruthless strategist he had ever had the pleasure of representing. He explained that she had instructed him to draft a very specific ironclad legal mechanism buried deep within the corporate bylaws and her personal trust fund. She had called it her final insurance policy. Vincent legally defined it as the Betrayal clause. I sat perfectly still, listening intently as Vincent explained the brilliant, devastating trap my beautiful wife had laid from beyond the grave. The betrayal clause was essentially a legal dead man switch. It explicitly stated that if Terrence ever made a formal documented attempt to misappropriate corporate assets, usurp unauthorized control of the estate, or publicly sever his familial ties with me, a catastrophic financial failsafe would be instantly triggered. Vivian had structured the company bylaws so that every single share of stock Terrence owned, his entire 20% equity in Crawford Construction, was strictly conditional. It was a privilege, not a right. If the clause was triggered by his own treacherous actions, his shares would not just be temporarily suspended. They would be automatically devalued to exactly $1 per share. And that extreme devaluation would immediately trigger a forced corporate buyout by the company treasury. The shares would then be instantly liquidated, and the total resulting funds would be irrevocably transferred into a charity foundation focused entirely on supporting underprivileged black youth in the inner city. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. Terrence thought he was the untouchable heir to a kingdom. He thought he could push the old black man out the door and comfortably take the throne for himself alongside his arrogant wife. He had absolutely no idea that the crown he was trying to steal was wired with high-voltage electricity. Vivian had built an invisible, impenetrable fortress around me that they could not see until they were already locked inside the execution chamber. She made sure that if they ever tried to take what was mine, the money would go directly to the very people Chloe looked down upon the most. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the desk, and asked Vincent if the events of the weekend were enough to detonate the trap. Terrence had stood in front of 50 people at my barbecue, including my most vital bank executives, and publicly declared that I was not his father. He had actively tried to humiliate me and sever our ties. Vincent smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He said that the public declaration was certainly a strong foundation, but it was just the beginning. The attempted midnight data theft from my private server, the unauthorized transfer attempt from the charity trust, and the forged medical conservatorship documents were the absolute nail in the coffin. There was no gray area left. The clause was officially active. Terrence had detonated his own financial life, and he did not even realize he was standing directly in the center of the blast radius. As we were discussing the final paperwork required to initiate the automatic transfer of his shares, a sharp, repetitive chiming sound echoed through the quiet office. It was coming from Vincent's computer. Ever since the data breach attempt in my study, Vincent had placed a highly aggressive real-time monitoring trace on every single corporate credit card and bank account associated with my company. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard to open the alert, and his eyes narrowed sharply. He turned the large monitor around so I could clearly see the screen. It was a live pending transaction alert from a high-end luxury European auto dealership located across town. Terrence was currently standing inside a pristine showroom swiping his top-tier corporate black card. But he was not buying heavy machinery or fleet vehicles for the construction business. The pending transaction was for $145,000. The item listed on the digital invoice was a brand new fully loaded Porsche 911, and the name registered on the title transfer was not Terrence. It was Richard Sterling. My ungrateful son was actively using my company money to buy a luxury sports car for the fugitive con artist who had abandoned him 45 years ago. He was draining my accounts to fund the extravagant lifestyle of a man currently being hunted by federal tax agents. Terrence and Richard were probably standing in that dealership right now, shaking hands, completely convinced they had unlimited power and an endless supply of my hard-earned cash. They thought my corporate card was their own personal piggy bank. I stared at the blinking transaction on the screen. The sheer staggering audacity of it erased any lingering shred of pity I might have had left for the boy I raised. I looked up at Vincent. The coldness in my voice surprised even me. I told him to freeze everything. I told him to lock every single account, cancel every line of credit, and invalidate every corporate card bearing my name or my company logo. I told him to do it right now. Vincent needed exactly 48 hours to completely finalize the execution of the betrayal clause and file the injunctions that would permanently sever Terrence from my empire. He needed time to process the asset freezes and ensure that when the hammer finally fell, no expensive defense attorney could ever find a single loophole. I needed to buy him that time. I needed to create a distraction so massive and so consuming that Terrence and Chloe would not even notice the financial walls closing in around them until it was entirely too late. I needed to play the Trojan horse. I drove back to my estate and walked directly into my study. I took a small state-of-the-art micro-recorder I had purchased specifically for this occasion and clipped it securely to the inside collar of my undershirt, completely hidden from view. I rolled up my sleeve and double-checked my smartwatch, ensuring the emergency medical SOS feature was primed and ready to deploy with a single prolonged press of a button. I was about to give the performance of a lifetime. I was going to test the absolute limits of their humanity. I wanted to see once and for all if there was even a single shred of a soul left inside the boy I had raised. I picked up my phone and dialed Terrence. When he answered, I did not use my normal commanding voice. I let my breathing become ragged and shallow. I gasped into the receiver, making a weak, terrible choking sound. "Terrence," I wheezed, clutching my chest even though my heart was beating with perfect cold rhythm. "Terrence, please. Something is wrong. My chest is incredibly tight. I cannot breathe. The pain is shooting down my left arm. Please get over to the house right now. I think I am having a massive heart attack." I dropped the phone onto the hardwood floor, letting it clatter loudly before ending the call. Then I lowered myself onto the expensive Persian rug in the center of my study. I lay there on my back, clutching my shirt, slowing my breathing and waiting for the vultures to arrive. It took them exactly 14 minutes to reach the estate. I heard the screech of tires on the pavement outside, followed by the heavy front door swinging open violently. Footsteps echoed rapidly through the grand foyer. The door to my study burst open. Terrence and Chloe rushed into the room. I kept my eyes half closed, my breathing labored and erratic. I let out a weak groan, reaching a trembling hand out toward the man I had called my son for 4 decades. "Help me," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured terror. "Please call an ambulance. I am dying." But Terrence did not pull out his phone. He did not drop to his knees to perform chest compressions. He did not even offer me a single word of comfort. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. He stood over me, looking down at my gasping body with a cold, analytical stare. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Chloe was standing right beside him, her arms crossed over her chest, her face completely devoid of any human empathy. "Looks like it," Terrence replied. "His tone looks like it." Terrence replied, his tone chillingly detached. "He is struggling to breathe. His pulse is jumping all over the place." I let out another pathetic groan, begging them to call for help. Terrence finally crouched down beside me, but he did not check my airways. He did not comfort me. His hands moved quickly and aggressively, patting down the pockets of my trousers. He reached into my back pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. He opened it, checking the contents before sliding it directly into his own jacket pocket. Then he reached into my front pocket and pulled out the heavy keyring that held the master access cards to the corporate headquarters and the physical override keys to the wall safe hidden behind my desk. "What are you doing?" Chloe whispered, watching him pocket my keys. "If he dies right here, right now, we do not even need the fake medical documents," Terrence muttered, his eyes darting toward the hidden safe. "We do not need the conservatorship. We do not need to fight him in court. Everything automatically transfers to the estate, and as his only legal heir, I take control immediately. But I need to make sure I secure the physical assets in this house before the police or the paramedics arrive and lock down the scene." He stood back up, completely ignoring my simulated agony on the floor. I lay there, my heart breaking in ways a medical heart attack could never achieve. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the boy I had stayed awake with when he had a terrible fever as a child. And here he was, literally picking the pockets of what he believed was my dying body, far more concerned with securing my safe keys than securing my life. "We should call 911 eventually," Terrence said casually, glancing at his expensive watch. "We have to make it look like we actually tried to save him." Chloe scoffed, stepping carefully around my legs so her designer shoes would not touch my clothes. "Just let him lie there for another 10 minutes, she said coldly. "Let nature take its course. If the paramedics get here too fast, they might actually save him. And then we are right back to square one with the medical board and the lawyers." 10 minutes, Terrence. Let him fade out. It solves all of our problems permanently. The sheer absolute evil of her words echoed in the quiet study. She was actively advocating for my murder by negligence, and my son was standing right there nodding in silent agreement. He was going to stand over my body and watch me die just to expedite his inheritance. They thought they were alone. They thought their sick, twisted conspiracy was safe within the thick walls of my study. They had absolutely no idea that the micro-recorder clipped to my undershirt was capturing every single damning syllable in high-definition audio. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of their moral bankruptcy and criminal intent. I had heard enough. While Terrence walked over to the bookshelf to begin testing the safe keys, I slowly rolled my wrist over. I pressed my thumb firmly against the side button of my smartwatch and held it down for 5 consecutive seconds. The watch silently vibrated against my skin. The emergency SOS protocol was activated. It instantly bypassed all normal channels and sent a priority distress signal along with my exact GPS coordinates directly to the local emergency dispatch center. Because of my age and my pre-registered medical history, a code red ambulance was immediately deployed to my estate. I kept up my performance. I let my eyes flutter shut, my breathing slowing down to a faint rattle. 5 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Terrence was busy opening the wall safe, stuffing stacks of emergency cash and private bearer bonds into his briefcase. Chloe was casually pacing the room, occasionally glancing down at me to see if I had stopped breathing yet. Then the piercing wail of sirens shattered the quiet afternoon. The sound was distant at first, but it approached with terrifying speed. The sirens grew louder and louder, echoing down the long driveway of the estate. Chloe froze. Her eyes went wide with sudden panic. "What is that?" she snapped. "Did you call them?" Terrence dropped a stack of bonds and spun around his face, completely pale. "No, I did not call anyone. I have not even touched my phone." The heavy flashing red and white lights of the ambulance illuminated the windows of my study. The sound of heavy boots sprinting up the front steps echoed through the house. They realized instantly that their perfect plan had just violently derailed. Terrence scrambled away from the safe, slamming the heavy steel door shut and locking it in a blind panic. The moment the paramedics burst through the front door shouting my name, my ungrateful son underwent a miraculous, sickening transformation. The cold, calculating scavenger vanished. In his place was the weeping, terrified, dutiful son. He threw himself onto the floor next to me, grabbing my hand and sobbing loudly. "Dad, Dad, please stay with me," Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with perfectly manufactured grief. The paramedics rushed into the room with their equipment bags and a collapsible stretcher. "Oh, thank God you are here," Terrence cried out, looking up at the medics with tears streaming down his face. I came over as fast as I could. "I think he is having a heart attack. Please, you have to save him. He is my father." Chloe stood behind him, covering her mouth with her hands, pretending to be absolutely paralyzed by the shock and tragedy of the moment. It was a performance worthy of a silver screen, but I knew the truth. And more importantly, the tiny microphone hidden beneath my collar knew the absolute truth. The paramedics quickly loaded me onto the stretcher, strapping me down and placing an oxygen mask over my face. I kept my eyes half closed, playing the part of the weak, dying victim as they wheeled me out of my grand estate and into the flashing ambulance. Terrence stood on the porch, holding his wife, acting like a man whose world was falling apart. He thought he was watching a dying man being carried away. He had absolutely no idea he was watching the architect of his total destruction being safely escorted away before the bombs finally went off. The hospital room smelled of bleach and sterile linen. I kept my eyes closed and listened to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed. I was not dying, but the world outside this room needed to believe I was hanging by a very thin thread. I slowly opened my eyes. Sitting in the corner chair, flipping through a high-fashion magazine with absolute boredom, was Chloe. She did not look like a woman whose father-in-law had just suffered a massive cardiac event. She looked like a woman sitting in a waiting room, patiently anticipating a massive lottery payout. Outside the heavy wooden door of my private VIP suite, I could see the silhouette of a massive man through the frosted glass. Chloe had wasted absolutely no time. She had hired private security. She had placed a literal guard dog at my door to completely isolate me from the outside world. When Chloe noticed I was awake, she closed her magazine and stood up. She walked over to the side of my bed, her expensive perfume poorly masking the smell of the clinical room. "Look who finally decided to wake up," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You gave us quite a scare, Darnell. But do not worry about a single thing. Terrence and I are taking care of absolutely everything. We have instructed the hospital staff that you are not to receive any visitors. Your mind is in a very fragile state right now. Even your granddaughter Maya was turned away at the front desk, crying. We cannot have anyone upsetting you while we finalize the conservatorship paperwork." I let my breathing remain shallow and ragged. I stared at the ceiling, playing the part of the defeated, helpless old man. Chloe smiled a cold and hollow expression before turning back to her magazine. She thought she had me trapped in a sterile white prison. She thought she had successfully cut off all my communication and broken my spirit. She did not know that a man who builds skyscrapers always leaves a back door in the blueprints. About an hour later, the heavy door to my suite swung open violently. The private bodyguard tried to step in front of the doorway to block the entrance, but he was immediately brushed aside by a man wearing a pristine white coat. It was Dr. Lawrence. He was the chief of medicine at this hospital. More importantly, he was my oldest and most trusted friend. We had played poker every second Thursday of the month for the last 20 years. We had fished together, drank together, and buried our wives in the very same cemetery. Dr. Lawrence walked into the room holding a thick medical chart. He looked at Chloe with a gaze so cold it could freeze boiling water. "Excuse me, Madam," Dr. Lawrence said, his voice booming with absolute medical authority. "This is a critical care cardiac recovery unit. The patient requires absolute silence and zero external stress. I need you to vacate this room immediately." Chloe stood up, crossing her arms defensively, clearly unaccustomed to being given direct orders. "I am his daughter-in-law," she snapped. "I have the legal right to be here. Terrence and I are filing for medical guardianship. We are in charge of his care now." Dr. Lawrence did not even blink. "Until a judge signs that paper, I am the chief medical officer and I am in charge of his care," he replied, pointing a stern finger toward the hallway. "And my professional medical assessment is that your presence is actively elevating his blood pressure to dangerous levels. Security will escort you to the cafeteria downstairs. If you refuse to leave, I will have the police remove you from the premises for interfering with a critical patient. Now get out!" Chloe turned bright red. Her jaw tightened in pure fury. She snatched her designer purse from the chair, glared at me one last time, and stormed out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving her and her rented muscle completely locked out in the hallway. Dr. Lawrence walked over to the electronic blinds and closed them tight. He checked the hallway through the small observation window to ensure Chloe was gone and the guard was facing away. Then the stern professional doctor vanished and my old friend returned. He walked over to my bed, reached deep into the pocket of his white coat, and pulled out a small, cheap black prepaid mobile phone. He slid the device under my blanket. "Your lawyer Vincent called me an hour ago," Dr. Lawrence whispered, keeping his voice incredibly low. "He said you needed an untraceable line to the outside world. He also said to tell you the corporate lockdown is in full effect across all channels. You have a window of exactly 4 hours before Terrence realizes his company credit cards are declining at the registers." I nodded slowly, gripping the small plastic phone in my hand. "Thank you, old friend," I whispered back, my normal strong voice returning. "I owe you much more than a poker game for this." Dr. Lawrence smiled faintly, patted my shoulder gently, and told me to rest before turning and walking back out to the hallway, loudly instructing the nurses to keep my door strictly locked. I was entirely alone in the quiet room. The trap was set, but it was time to turn the screws. I pulled the black burner phone from under the covers and powered it on. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room. Chloe and Terrence thought they had completely paralyzed me. They thought I was lying here helpless while they raided my kingdom and stole my legacy. They forgot one fundamental rule about the man who raised them. I know everything about my enemies. Terrence always believed he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. He thought his private personal bank accounts were completely secure from my sight. He used highly complex security software and bragged constantly about his encrypted offshore accounts. But Terrence was also incredibly lazy and deeply predictable. When he was 16 years old, I bought him his first car, a vintage blue Mustang. He loved that car more than anything in the world. He crashed it 2 years later trying to impress a girl. Ever since that day, every single password, every secure login, and every digital vault he ever created used the exact same variation of that car's license plate and his mother's birth year. He never changed it because he never thought anyone would be smart enough to remember such an old detail. I opened the secure web browser on the burner phone. I navigated directly to the login portal of his private high-yield offshore banking institution. My thick, calloused fingers typed in his private email address. Then I entered the password. The screen loaded for a brief second before confirming access. I was inside his financial fortress. I looked at the total balance of his personal hidden account. It sat at just over $800,000. This was the money he had slowly and illegally siphoned away from my company over the years. This was his secret safety net. This was the money he planned to use to fund his new aristocratic life with Richard Sterling once he pushed me into a nursing home. I tapped the screen to initiate a new wire transfer, but I was not going to send the money back to my own company. That would be far too simple, and it would give his lawyers a chance to freeze the transaction and claim I had hacked his personal devices. No, I had a much more poetic and destructive destination in mind. Dr. Montgomery had informed me earlier that Richard Sterling was facing massive federal charges from the Internal Revenue Service. He owed the government a mountain of back taxes, and federal agents were actively hunting him down to build a racketeering case. Terrence had already co-signed a $1 million private loan for that criminal. Now it was time to deeply intertwine their financial ruins in a way no lawyer could ever untangle. I set the transfer amount for exactly $500,000. I moved to the recipient information section. I did not enter a shady shell company or a hidden trust. I entered the official routing number for the United States Department of the Treasury. In the payment memo section, I typed something very specific and absolutely lethal. I wrote voluntary tax restitution payment on behalf of Richard Sterling. I stared at the confirmation screen. This single transaction was a masterstroke of absolute destruction. By sending $500,000 of Terrence stolen money directly to the federal government to pay off Richard's tax debt, I was achieving two devastating goals with one single push of a button. First, I was financially crippling Terrence, completely draining the safety net he so desperately relied on. Second, and most importantly, I was creating an undeniable, legally binding financial link between Terrence and a wanted federal fugitive. When the IRS received that massive payment, they would immediately trace the source of the funds. They would see that Terrence Crawford was liquidating his personal wealth to harbor and aid a man under active federal investigation. Terrence was not just going to be broke. He was going to have federal tax agents knocking down his front door by morning, demanding to know his involvement in a criminal enterprise. I did not hesitate for another second. I pressed my thumb against the bright green confirm button on the screen. The small loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds. Then a bright check mark appeared. The funds were successfully transferred. The money was gone forever. The trap had officially snapped shut on his ankle. I locked the burner phone and slid it back beneath my mattress. I leaned my head back against the crisp hospital pillows and let out a long, slow breath. The heart monitor beeped with a steady, relaxed rhythm. Outside my door, the rented bodyguard stood watch, making sure no one could get in to save me. Downstairs, Chloe sat in the cafeteria drinking expensive coffee, entirely convinced she had won the war and secured her fortune. They thought they had locked a dying old man in a cage. They had absolutely no idea they had just locked themselves inside a burning building with no exit. I lay in my hospital bed watching the second hand on the wall clock tick away. Vincent had promised me that the financial guillotine would drop in exactly 4 hours. He was a man of his word. My burner phone vibrated against my leg under the thin hospital blanket. It was a text message from Vincent. The message contained only 3 words: the trap closed. While I was lying in a sterile room pretending to be at death's door, my ungrateful son and his wife were standing inside the most exclusive European auto dealership in the city. I knew exactly how it played out because Vincent had a private investigator sitting in a parked car across the street watching the entire glorious disaster unfold and texting me the updates. Terrence and Chloe had walked into the pristine glass-walled showroom like royalty. They were there to finalize the purchase of the fully loaded Porsche 911 for Richard Sterling. Terrence was wearing a custom suit trying to project the image of a titan of industry. Chloe had a designer handbag slung over her arm, sipping complimentary sparkling water, looking down her nose at the sales staff. They thought they had just secured the keys to my entire kingdom. They thought the old man was incapacitated and the vault was left wide open. Terrence confidently approached the finance manager desk. The manager, a polished man in a sharp tie, presented the final invoice, $145,000. Terrence did not even blink. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out the heavy metal corporate black card bearing my company logo. He tossed it onto the glass desk with the casual arrogance of a man spending someone else's blood and sweat. The manager smiled politely, picked up the card, and swiped it through the terminal. He waited for the satisfying beep of approval. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, flat error tone. The screen flashed a bright red message. Transaction declined. The manager frowned, apologizing profusely. He wiped the magnetic strip and inserted the chip again. Another harsh beep. Declined. He looked up at Terrence, his professional smile faltering just a fraction. "I am sorry, sir, but the card is not going through," he said softly. "Perhaps there is a daily spending limit we need to clear with your bank." Terrence scoffed loudly, clearly annoyed that his grand moment of wealth was being interrupted by a technical glitch. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, raising his voice just enough to make sure the other wealthy customers in the showroom turned to look. "Run it again. There is no limit on that account. I am the acting vice president of Crawford Construction. The manager typed a manual override code and submitted the transaction directly to the merchant bank. This time, the terminal did not just decline the purchase. The system completely locked the transaction. A glaring alert popped up on the manager private monitor. Code 04, report stolen card, suspected corporate financial fraud, do not return card to customer, contact local authorities immediately. The finance manager was a professional who dealt with high net worth individuals every single day. He knew exactly what that code meant. He looked at Terrence, then looked at the metal card in his hand. He swallowed hard, completely changing his demeanor. "Sir, it appears there is a hard lock on this account," he said smoothly, masking his rising panic. "I am going to need to step into the back office to call the merchant services hotline and get this cleared up. It should only take a moment." Terrence rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Make it fast. We have a very busy schedule today." Chloe let out an exasperated sigh, fanning herself with a glossy car brochure. "This is so embarrassing, Terrence," she whispered sharply. "Make sure they know we are not some street trash trying to bounce a check." Terrence reached into his pocket. "Just use my personal black card," he snapped, throwing his private offshore bank card onto the desk. The one tied to the account I had just completely drained to pay off Richard's federal tax debt. "Just put the whole car on this one," Terrence commanded. "I will deal with the corporate account later. Let us just get out of here." The manager nodded slowly, taking the second card and quickly retreating into the secure glass office behind the main desk. He did not call the merchant bank. He picked up his desk phone and dialed 911. He reported that a man was attempting to purchase a luxury vehicle using flagged stolen corporate credit cards and that the bank system was actively warning of major financial fraud. Terrence and Chloe stood in the middle of the bright, pristine showroom for 10 agonizing minutes. They complained loudly about the terrible customer service. They admired their reflections in the polished hood of the Porsche. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was currently speeding toward them with flashing red and blue lights. Two police cruisers pulled up directly to the front of the dealership, their sirens cutting sharply through the quiet afternoon air. 4 uniformed officers stepped out and walked briskly through the heavy glass doors of the showroom. The casual chatter of the wealthy patrons instantly died down. Everyone stopped to stare. The finance manager stepped out of his back office and pointed a shaking finger directly at my son. "That is him," the manager said. The system flagged both of his cards for severe corporate fraud and theft. Terrence turned around, his face morphing from arrogant annoyance to absolute blinding confusion. The officers did not approach him with the respect he believed his tailored suit demanded. They approached him like a common criminal attempting a high-dollar felony. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," the lead officer commanded, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt. Terrence let out a nervous, utterly baffled laugh. "What is this?" he stammered. "There has to be a mistake. I am Terrence Crawford. I am trying to buy a car. My cards are perfectly fine." The officer stepped forward, grabbing Terrence by the arm and spinning him around forcefully against the pristine hood of the Porsche. "You are being detained on suspicion of corporate financial fraud and attempting to process transactions with stolen assets," the officer said coldly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical scream. "Get your hands off my husband!" she shrieked, her high society facade completely shattering in front of the entire dealership. "He is a wealthy man. You cannot do this to us. Do you know who we are?" The sound of the metal handcuffs clicking tightly around Terrence's wrists echoed beautifully in my mind as I read the text updates from my investigator. Terrence was hyperventilating, struggling against the officers, his face pressed against the cold metal of the car he thought he was buying. His perfectly styled hair was ruined. His dignity was entirely stripped away in front of the very class of people he so desperately wanted to impress. "This is a mistake," Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror as the officers marched him across the showroom floor. "Call my father, call my lawyer, call the bank." They shoved him into the back of the police cruiser, slamming the door shut on his pathetic demands. Chloe was left standing entirely alone in the middle of the dealership, trembling violently, surrounded by whispering strangers pointing their phones at her. Her designer handbag suddenly looked very cheap. Her arrogant posture crumbled into absolute panic. She was completely isolated. Her husband was in the back of a police car, and their endless supply of money had just slammed into a concrete wall. In her sheer desperation, Chloe did the only thing she could think of. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed the hospital room. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling waiting for it. The sterile white phone on my bedside table began to ring loudly. I let it ring 3 times. Then I slowly reached over and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, making my voice sound incredibly weak, raspy, and terribly confused. "Darnell. Darnell. Thank God you are awake." Chloe sobbed hysterically into the phone. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of her usual condescending poison. "You have to help us. Something terrible has happened. The police just arrested Terrence. They are saying the corporate cards are stolen. They are saying there is massive fraud. You have to call the bank right now and clear this up. You have to tell them he has authorization." I let a long, painful silence stretch over the phone line. I listened to her hyperventilating, begging the man she had just left to die on a study floor a few hours ago. I cleared my throat, forcing a pathetic rattling cough. "Oh, my dear daughter-in-law," I whispered, my voice trembling with the perfect pitch of advanced senility. "I am so sorry. My head is just spinning so much today. The doctors gave me some medicine and I just cannot seem to think straight. Darnell, please listen to me." Chloe screamed, her panic reaching an absolute fever pitch. "You need to call the bank. Give me the authorization codes. Give me the passwords to unlock the account so I can bail him out." I smiled, a cold, ruthless smile into the empty hospital room. The trap had not just closed, it had locked. "I am so confused, Chloe," I murmured, trailing off into a pathetic, helpless sigh. I tried to remember the passwords. I really did. But my mind is just slipping away. I guess I am just a crazy old man after all. I completely forgot how to unlock the accounts. I gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle, cutting off her desperate sobbing screams, and closed my eyes to rest. Less than 2 hours after Chloe hung up the phone in a blind panic, the heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open again. There was no arrogant strut this time. There was no condescending smile. Chloe looked like she had just survived a violent shipwreck. Her pristine blonde hair was a tangled, damp mess sticking to her forehead. Her expensive mascara was running down her pale cheeks in thick black streaks. Her designer dress was wrinkled and stained with sweat. The high society illusion was completely shattered. She was finally facing the brutal reality of the real world, a world where my money was no longer there to protect her. She did not yell. She did not make any demands. She walked slowly to the side of my bed, her legs visibly trembling, and she did something I never thought I would live to see. Chloe dropped to her knees on the cold, sterile linoleum floor. "Darnell, please," she sobbed, grabbing the edge of my thin hospital blanket with shaking hands. "You have to help us. Please, I am begging you." They set his bail at $250,000. Every single account is frozen. My credit cards are declining at the front desk. The bank will not even speak to me. He is sitting in a downtown holding cell with violent criminals. He is terrified. You have to sign the release forms to unfreeze the assets. You are his father. I looked down at her. I let a long, heavy silence fill the room. I let her feel the absolute crushing weight of her own powerlessness. This was the same woman who had laughed at me at the country club. This was the same woman who had stood in my study and suggested they let me die on the floor just to speed up her inheritance. And now she was kneeling at my feet, crying tears of genuine desperation, begging for a fraction of the empire she had tried to steal. "Oh, Chloe," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly weak and raspy. "I do not understand what is happening. My mind is so foggy today. The doctors gave me so much medicine. Why would the police arrest my boy? Why would the bank freeze the accounts?" She cried harder, her manicured nails digging into the mattress. "It is a massive misunderstanding," she pleaded, lying through her teeth even when she had nothing left. "It is just a corporate error. But we need your signature. If you just sign the guarantor release form, the bail bondsman will get him out tonight. If he stays in that jail cell all weekend, he will not survive. Please, Darnell." I let out a slow, rattling sigh. I played the part of the confused, merciful father who just wanted his family to be safe. "Okay, Chloe," I murmured gently. "I want my son to come home. My lawyer Vincent stopped by earlier today. He left a red folder in my overnight bag in the closet. He said if there was ever a corporate emergency, Terrence needs to sign the primary liability waiver. Vincent said if Terrence signs it, the company treasury will automatically release the emergency funds to the bail bondsman." Chloe did not walk to the closet. She practically crawled. She tore open my leather overnight bag and pulled out the thick red folder. Inside was a dense, multi-page legal document drafted by Vincent. It was typed in heavy, intimidating legalese. Chloe was hyperventilating. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pages. She did not read a single paragraph. She did not look at the subheadings. She was operating on pure blind panic. If she had simply taken 60 seconds to read the second page, she would have seen the bold words printed near the bottom. Voluntary resignation. Unconditional surrender of corporate shares. Complete relinquishment of executive authority. It was not a bail release form. It was a document confirming that Terrence was voluntarily stepping down from his position as vice president and handing every single ounce of his decision-making power and company equity directly back to me. It was the absolute surrender of his entire corporate life. "Thank you, Darnell," Chloe cried, clutching the red folder to her chest like it was a life preserver. "Thank you so much. I am going to the police station right now. We will take care of you. I promise we will make this right." She ran out of the hospital room, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. The moment she was gone, I sat up in my bed. My trembling stopped. I picked up my burner phone and sent a single text message to Vincent. I told him the package was on the move. Later that evening, Vincent relayed the exact sequence of events to me. I could perfectly picture the miserable scene at the downtown police precinct. The air in those holding cells smells like sweat bleach and pure despair. Terrence was sitting on a cold steel bench. He had been stripped of his tailored suit jacket and his expensive silk tie. He was a soft, pampered man pretending to be hard, and the reality of a concrete cell had completely broken him. He was terrified of the hardened criminals pacing the room around him. He was a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life, and the isolation was eating him alive. Chloe rushed into the visitation area frantic and out of breath. She shoved the dense legal document through the small slot in the consultation glass. "Sign it, Terrence," she urged him urgently. "Your dad authorized the bail money. He is confused, but he wants to help. You just have to sign this corporate waiver first, so the lawyers can release the cash." Terrence did not hesitate. He did not ask to read the fine print. He did not ask to consult with his own attorney. He was completely consumed by his own cowardice and his desperate need to escape that holding cell. He grabbed the cheap plastic pen the guard offered him. His hand was shaking violently. He flipped to the last page and signed his name on the dotted line. In a matter of seconds, without even realizing it, my ungrateful son signed his entire corporate life away. He signed away his 20% stake in my empire. He signed away his executive salary. He handed the absolute keys to the kingdom right back to the man he had betrayed. Chloe immediately handed the signed document to the precinct notary, who faxed a certified copy directly to Vincent's office. Vincent reviewed the signature, confirmed it was legally binding, and then, honoring his end of the trap, he wired the bail money. 2 hours later, the heavy metal doors of the downtown police precinct buzzed open. Terrence walked out into the cool night air. He was exhausted, shivering, and deeply humiliated. He looked up at the streetlights, taking a deep breath, thinking the absolute worst of the nightmare was finally over. He thought his father had bailed him out because blood is thicker than water. He thought he had survived the storm. He walked over to Chloe, who was waiting by a cab on the curb. He reached into the plastic evidence bag the police had returned to him and pulled out his personal mobile phone. He pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dark sidewalk. The phone instantly began to vibrate violently in his hand. A barrage of missed calls and urgent notifications flooded the screen. Right at the top of the list was a single newly delivered text message. It was from Richard Sterling. The aristocratic facade of his biological father was completely gone. The message was not a friendly greeting. It was a brutal, terrifying promise. The text read, "What the hell did you do? The IRS just raided my house and seized every single account I have. They said a massive wire transfer from your name triggered a federal freeze. You brought the feds right to my front door. You ruined my life. You are dead. I am going to kill you." Terrence stared at the glowing screen. The color completely drained from his face for the second time that day. He dropped his phone onto the concrete sidewalk. The glass screen shattered into a dozen pieces. He finally realized the horrifying truth. He had not escaped the storm. He had just walked directly into the center of a hurricane. Terrence had spent the entire weekend living in absolute suffocating terror. He was dodging violent phone calls from Richard Sterling, the biological father who had explicitly threatened to kill him over the frozen federal bank accounts. Desperation makes a weak man incredibly predictable. I knew exactly what Terrence would do to save his own skin. He had to promise Richard the moon. He convinced the desperate con artist that if they just waited until Monday morning, Terrence would officially take control of the Crawford construction treasury and wire enough millions to make the federal agents disappear forever. So at exactly 9 in the morning on Monday, my ungrateful son convened an emergency hostile takeover meeting with my board of directors. He held the meeting in the grand boardroom on the top floor of my corporate headquarters. It is a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the very city skyline I helped build. The long mahogany table was surrounded by 12 of my most trusted senior executives, men and women who had worked by my side for decades. They sat in their heavy leather chairs, murmuring in confusion. Terrence stood at the head of the table, occupying my chair. He was wearing a brand new navy blue suit, trying desperately to project absolute authority. But the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his deep panic. Standing right beside him was Chloe. She was dressed in a sharp white designer pantsuit, looking like a vulture ready to feast on a fresh carcass. She held a thick stack of manila folders, completely convinced that she was about to become the queen of the empire. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Terrence began, his voice projecting a perfectly manufactured tone of deep sorrow. "Thank you for assembling on such short notice. I come to you today with a very heavy heart. As some of you may have heard, my father, Darnell Crawford, suffered a massive and catastrophic medical event this past weekend." A murmur of genuine shock and concern rippled through the board members. Terrence raised his hand to silence them, playing the part of the brave, grieving son to absolute perfection. "He survived the physical heart attack," Terrence continued, wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of his eye. "But the doctors have informed us that the lack of oxygen to his brain has caused rapid and irreversible cognitive decline. He has been officially diagnosed with advanced aggressive dementia. He is currently confined to a secure medical facility, completely unaware of his surroundings." Chloe stepped forward on cue. She opened her folders and began sliding glossy, highly official-looking medical documents across the polished mahogany table. These were the fake medical records she had purchased from the black market for $10,000. She slid them toward my chief financial officer and my lead operations director. "These are the certified evaluations from his primary care physicians," Chloe said smoothly, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "They confirm that Darnell is entirely mentally incompetent. He can no longer make rational decisions for himself, let alone for a multi-million-dollar corporation. It is a tragic end for a great man, but we must protect the future of this company." Terrence placed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward to look at the board. "Therefore, according to the corporate bylaws regarding medical incapacitation, I am formally submitting my petition to be recognized immediately as the permanent chief executive officer of Crawford Construction." The board members exchanged very uneasy glances. My chief financial officer, a sharp woman named Sarah, who had balanced my books for 20 years, frowned deeply at the paperwork. "This is highly irregular, Terrence," she said cautiously. "Darnell was perfectly fine at the barbecue just 2 days ago. We cannot just hand over the company without a proper legal transition and verification from our own corporate medical team." Terrence's jaw tightened. He did not have time for verification. He had a federal fugitive breathing down his neck. "That is why I have taken the liberty of bringing in an outside expert to audit our accounts and facilitate this transition smoothly," Terrence announced quickly. He gestured toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The doors opened and Richard Sterling walked in. Richard was sweating profusely. His tailored suit looked a little rumpled, and his eyes darted around the room with the paranoid energy of a man who knows the authorities are hunting him. But he forced a wide, arrogant smile onto his face. He walked right up to the front of the room and stood next to Terrence. "Board members," Terrence said, his voice swelling with toxic pride, "I would like to introduce you to Richard Sterling. He is a highly accomplished wealth manager. He is also my biological father. Darnell kept my true heritage a secret from me for 45 years, but Richard and I have finally reunited. He will be stepping in as the new senior financial advisor for Crawford Construction, effective immediately." The audacity of the move was absolutely staggering. Terrence was publicly rejecting my name and installing a wanted criminal to manage my treasury all in one single breath. Chloe, completely drunk on her own fabricated victory, motioned to a catering assistant standing in the corner of the room. The assistant nervously pushed a silver cart forward loaded with crystal flutes and a bucket of ice. Chloe actually picked up a bottle of imported champagne and popped the cork right there in the middle of a corporate board meeting. She poured the bubbling liquid into the glasses, her face beaming with pure, unrestrained greed. "Let us raise a glass," Chloe announced loudly, handing a glass to Terrence and then to Richard. "To new beginnings, to the future of Crawford Construction, to a new modern era." They clinked their glasses together. They smiled. They thought they had won. They thought the old black man was locked away in a sterile white room, slowly losing his mind. They were completely, devastatingly wrong. 3 floors down, I was sitting quietly in the private office of my lead attorney, Vincent. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah, my loyal chief financial officer who had been secretly messaging me under the table the entire time. The text said simply, "The champagne is poured." I stood up. I was not wearing a hospital gown. I was not leaning on a cane. I was not sitting in a wheelchair. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than Richard Sterling's entire net worth. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. My gold watch rested heavily on my wrist. I looked like a man who could buy and sell the entire room without blinking. Vincent stood up beside me holding a black leather briefcase. Behind him stood 2 very large, very serious men wearing dark windbreakers. Printed in bold yellow letters across the back of their jackets were the letters FBI. "It is time," I said calmly. We took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. The ride up was entirely silent. The doors slid open with a soft chime. We walked down the thick carpet of the executive hallway. I did not knock on the boardroom doors. I did not ask for permission to enter my own kingdom. I placed my hands on the heavy brass handles and pushed the massive oak doors wide open. The doors hit the walls with a loud, thunderous crack that echoed through the entire room. The champagne glass literally slipped from Chloe's fingers. It hit the mahogany table and shattered into a dozen pieces, spilling expensive liquor all over her fake medical documents. Terrence froze. His mouth dropped open. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stared at me as if I were a ghost rising from the grave. Richard stumbled backward, his eyes locking instantly onto the federal agent standing right behind my shoulders. His fake, aristocratic smile completely melted into pure, unadulterated terror. The entire board of directors gasped. Sarah, my chief financial officer, let out a massive sigh of relief and leaned back in her chair. I walked slowly and deliberately to the head of the table. My footsteps were the only sound in the dead, suffocating silence of the room. I stopped right next to Terrence. He was trembling so violently that the ice in the champagne bucket rattled. "You are looking a little pale, Terrence," I said, my voice deep, smooth, and echoing with absolute authority. "Did you really think you could throw a party in my house without inviting the host?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The sheer weight of my presence in that boardroom was enough to suck all the air out of the room. Terrence stumbled backward, his legs tangling in his own feet. He practically fell out of the heavy leather chair at the head of the table. That was my chair. It has always been my chair. I walked forward slowly, each step echoing against the hardwood floor. I smoothed the front of my charcoal gray suit and sat down. I rested my hands on the cool mahogany. I looked at the board members. I looked at Chloe, whose arrogant face had melted into a mask of pure horror. And finally, I looked at Richard Sterling, the fake aristocrat who was currently sweating through his cheap cologne. At the barbecue on Saturday, I held up a sealed white envelope. Chloe had laughed and told everyone I was losing my mind. She tried to snatch it from my hands like a greedy vulture. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out that exact same envelope. I placed it flat on the center of the table. The soft sound of the paper touching the wood echoed like a gunshot. Terrence could not take his eyes off it. He was trembling violently. He knew that whatever was inside that envelope was going to completely erase his future. I broke the seal. I pulled out a thick stack of folded papers, written in the beautiful, flowing handwriting of my late wife, Vivian. I smoothed the pages flat and looked directly at the son I had raised. I told the room that Vivian was a woman who saw everything. She loved her son, but she was never blind to his greed. I began to read her words out loud. Her letter started with a mother breaking heart. She wrote that she watched Terrence change over the years. She wrote about how the money I earned with my calloused hands had made him soft, arrogant, and cruel. She detailed exact dates and amounts of money Terrence had quietly siphoned from my personal accounts over the past decade. She documented his reckless gambling debts long before my private investigators ever found them. She wrote about Chloe, describing her as a parasite who was slowly poisoning her son's mind with delusions of upper-class grandeur. The board members sat in absolute, stunned silence. Sarah, my chief financial officer, shook her head in disgust. Terrence tried to speak. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to say his mother was crazy or confused, but no words came out. His throat was completely dry. Chloe backed away from the table, trying to distance herself from the sinking ship, but the 2 federal agents standing by the door blocked her only exit. But Vivian was not finished. The financial theft was only the beginning of the letter. The real destruction was hidden in the final pages. I pulled a second document from the envelope. It was not handwritten. It was a certified, laminated medical record from a highly respected genetics laboratory. It was dated 10 years ago. I held it up for the entire board of directors to see. I turned back to the final page of Vivian's letter and continued reading. Vivian wrote that she knew Terrence had been secretly searching for his biological father. She knew he felt disconnected from the black man who raised him and wanted to find the sophisticated, light-skinned man who had sired him. She knew Terrence had finally tracked down Richard Sterling and was secretly sending him money. I read Vivian's exact words. "Terrence, you think you found your bloodline. You think Richard Sterling is the missing piece of your aristocratic puzzle. But Richard is nothing but a gold-digging con artist. He is a smooth-talking grifter who lied to me when I was young and vulnerable. He vanished the second things got difficult. But more importantly, Terrence Richard is not your father." The boardroom went entirely still. Richard Sterling's face dropped. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked at Terrence, then back at me. Terrence began to shake his head in frantic denial. I kept reading Vivian's letter. She wrote that Richard was just a brief, terrible mistake she made while she was grieving. She wrote that Terrence's real biological father was a young, hard-working man who died in a tragic car accident 3 months before Terrence was even born. Richard only came back into the picture decades later because he smelled the Crawford money. He heard that the single mother he once abandoned had married a wealthy construction tycoon. Richard played along with the father narrative because it was the easiest way to manipulate a greedy, insecure son into opening up the corporate vault. I tossed the certified DNA results across the table. They slid perfectly to a stop right in front of Terrence. The medical document definitively proved there was zero genetic match between Terrence and Richard Sterling. Absolutely zero. Terrence was staring at the paper. His chest was heaving. He was hyperventilating, struggling to process the catastrophic reality of what he had done. He had stolen from his family, committed corporate fraud, and handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars to a complete stranger who shared absolutely none of his blood. Richard tried to step backward. He stammered, claiming the document was forged, claiming I had faked the laboratory results to steal his son away from him. But the federal agents stepped forward, their hands resting on their utility belts, silencing him instantly. Richard realized his entire grift was blown. He had spent months pretending to be a wealthy aristocrat returning for his long-lost son, when in reality he was just a desperate, broke fugitive, scamming an idiot who desperately wanted to belong to high society. I looked at Chloe. The racist undertones of her entire marriage were laid bare. She had spent her life looking down on my rough hands and my blue-collar roots. She had encouraged Terrence to embrace Richard because she wanted to be tied to elite old-money genetics. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that her husband was not the heir to an aristocratic fortune. He was the son of a working-class man who died in a car crash raised entirely by the charity of the very black man she so deeply despised. Her entire social climbing strategy had just collapsed into dust. I read the very last lines of Vivian's letter, her final message from the grave. She wrote Darnell knew everything. He knew about the DNA. He knew your real father was dead. He knew Richard was a parasite. But Darnell chose to protect us anyway. He chose to give you his name, his love, and his empire. He was the only real father you ever had, and you spent your entire life being ashamed of him. I set the letter down on the mahogany desk. I looked at the man I had called my son for 45 years. The psychological devastation was total and absolute. Terrence's knees literally gave out. He collapsed onto the floor of the boardroom right in front of the entire executive committee. He let out a gut-wrenching, pathetic sob. He had thrown away a fiercely loyal father who built a massive empire with his own bare hands, all to chase the illusion of a fake, sophisticated con artist who only wanted to drain his bank accounts. He had sacrificed his dignity, his freedom, and his soul for a biological lie. He was kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, surrounded by the shattered ruins of a kingdom that would never belong to him again. Richard Sterling stood frozen at the head of the long mahogany table. The certified DNA results lay flat against the polished wood, completely destroying the aristocratic illusion he had spent months building. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a maze with no exit. The sweat poured down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his cheap-tailored suit. He realized in that exact moment that the endless supply of money he thought he had secured was gone forever. He realized that Terrence was not his biological son, but just a gullible fool he had manipulated. But more importantly, he realized that the two large men standing by the boardroom doors were not corporate security guards. They were federal agents, and they were looking directly at him. Richard panicked. The smooth-talking upper-class facade evaporated in a single second. He shoved his heavy leather chair backward. The chair tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. He cursed violently, stringing together words that no high society gentleman would ever use. He turned away from the table and made a desperate, pathetic dash toward the heavy oak doors. He thought he could somehow push his way out of the executive suite and disappear back into the shadows. He did not make it more than 3 steps. The taller of the two FBI agents stepped forward with lightning speed. He grabbed Richard by the collar of his suit jacket and slammed him hard against the thick paneled wall of the boardroom. The violent impact rattled the crystal water glasses on the table. The agent swiftly kicked Richard's legs apart and pulled his arms painfully behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoed through the dead silence of the room. Richard Sterling, the agent, stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You are under federal arrest. The charges include massive tax evasion, interstate wire fraud, and criminal extortion. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." Richard struggled against the cold steel, his face pressed against the expensive wood paneling. He whined and pleaded. He told the agents that he was a victim. He cried out that Terrence was the one with the money, that Terrence was the one who authorized the wire transfers, and that he was just an innocent financial advisor. It was a pathetic, sickening display of cowardice. The agents ignored his desperate lies. They pulled him off the wall and dragged him out of the boardroom. The man who had walked in expecting to be crowned a king was escorted out like common street trash, his fake legacy completely erased in front of the most powerful executives in my company. The heavy doors closed behind them, and the boardroom fell into a suffocating silence once again. The only sound was the pathetic, ragged sobbing of Terrence, who was still kneeling on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He was completely broken. He had lost his father, his company, his wealth, and his biological illusion, all in the span of 10 minutes. Then the true nature of a parasite revealed itself. Chloe had been standing perfectly still, watching her entire luxurious future burn to ashes. She looked at Richard being dragged away. She looked at Terrence weeping on the floor. She realized that the ship was sinking fast and she needed to find a lifeboat immediately. Chloe is a survivor in the absolute worst sense of the word. She is loyal to nothing but her own comfort. Her entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant, untouchable daughter-in-law vanished. She forced her breathing to become rapid and shallow. She squeezed her eyes shut until tears began to stream down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She dropped to her knees, but she did not drop down next to her husband. She dropped to her knees, looking directly at the board of directors, and then she turned her tear-stained face toward me. "Darnell," she cried, her voice trembling with flawless, theatrical precision. "You have to believe me. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. He made me do it." She raised a manicured, trembling finger and pointed it directly at the man she had sworn to love and cherish. She pointed right at Terrence. The executives around the table stared at her in utter shock. Sarah, my chief financial officer, looked physically disgusted by the display. "He is a monster behind closed doors," Chloe sobbed loudly, weaving a masterclass of manipulation and deceit. "He controlled all of our finances. He controlled everything I did. When he found out about his real father, he went completely crazy. He was obsessed with proving he was better than his blue-collar upbringing. He told me that if I did not help him push you out of the company, he would take my daughter away from me and leave me on the streets." Terrence slowly lifted his head from the carpet. His eyes were red and swollen. He looked at the woman he had destroyed his entire life for. He looked at the woman who had mocked my rough hands, the woman who had constantly pushed him to demand more power, the woman who had actively plotted to leave me dying on a study floor. And now she was throwing him directly to the wolves without a second thought. Terrence opened his mouth to defend himself, to call out her lies, but he was too emotionally devastated. He just let out a hollow, broken gasp and lowered his head back down to the floor. The rats were finally biting each other in the dark. "I am just a manipulated wife," Chloe wept, burying her face in her hands. "I was terrified of him, Darnell. I tried to stop him from buying those fake medical documents. I really did. But he forced me to make the transactions. Please, you have to protect me. I am a victim of his greed. I am innocent." I sat in my chair at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her. I did not need to point out the absolute absurdity of her claims. I knew the final piece of the puzzle was already in motion. I just watched her perform, waiting for the curtain to fall. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened one final time. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was not another federal agent, and it was not a corporate security guard. It was my 19-year-old granddaughter, Maya. She was wearing a simple university sweatshirt, faded jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers. She looked completely out of place in a room full of expensive tailored suits and luxury fashion. But her posture was perfectly straight. Her jaw was set in stone. She walked with the exact same quiet, commanding strength that my beautiful Vivian used to have. She did not look at the stunned executives. She did not look at her father weeping on the floor. She walked directly toward the center of the massive mahogany table. Chloe looked up, her fake sobs pausing for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic crossed her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Maya, baby." Chloe cried out, reaching a trembling hand toward her daughter. "Tell your grandfather the truth. Tell him how much your father terrified us. Tell him how we are just innocent victims in all of this mess. Help me explain it to him, sweetheart." Maya stopped walking. She looked down at her mother kneeling on the floor. There was no pity in Maya's eyes. There was no confusion. There was only an expression of absolute freezing disgust. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a small silver USB flash drive. She leaned over the table and placed it right next to Vivian's handwritten letter. The metallic clink of the drive hitting the wood sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Maya looked at the board of directors, and then she looked directly at me. "Grandpa," she said, her voice clear, strong, and entirely unwavering, "that drive contains the backup audio recordings from the hidden camera system you installed in the house, but it also contains something much more specific." Maya turned her gaze back down to her mother. "I hacked into your personal laptop last night," Maya stated coldly. "I downloaded the encrypted audio files of your private voice over IP calls from the last 3 months. That drive holds the exact recordings of you aggressively negotiating the price of the fake Alzheimer diagnosis with the black market forger. It has you demanding a discount. It has you laughing about how easy it will be to lock my grandfather away and steal his property." Chloe's face turned the color of wet ash. Her mouth hung open, but the lies completely dried up in her throat. She stared at the silver USB drive as if it were a live grenade. "You were not forced," Maya said, her words slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. "You were not manipulated. You were the architect of this entire nightmare. Stop lying. Stop playing the victim. It makes you look pathetic." Chloe tried to speak, but only a desperate high-pitched wheeze escaped her lips. The absolute finality of her own daughter rejecting her of her own flesh and blood, exposing her profound wickedness to the world, was the fatal blow. Maya turned her back on her parents without a second glance. She walked around the massive table, stepping past the executives, and stood directly behind my heavy leather chair. She placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder. She looked around the room, making sure every single person understood exactly where her loyalty lived. "Grandpa," Maya said softly, her voice filled with a fierce, unbreakable love, "I stand with you." Chloe let out a genuine, piercing wail of pure defeat. It was the sound of an arrogant soul shattering into a million unfixable pieces. Her knees gave out completely. The high society queen, the woman who thought she was infinitely better than the blue-collar builder who funded her life, collapsed flat onto the floor. She clutched her stomach, rocking back and forth next to the husband she had just tried to destroy. She was reduced to a sobbing, ruined mess on the carpet of my boardroom. The poison was completely drawn out. The empire was officially purged. At my own backyard barbecue, surrounded by 50 guests, including my biggest business partners, my son crushed his 6th beer, pointed a shaking finger right at my chest, and shouted, "He is not my father." The music seemed to stop. You could hear a pin drop on the stone patio. I did not yell. I did not throw him out. I just calmly wiped the barbecue sauce from my hands, pulled a sealed envelope from my shirt pocket, and said, "That is strange because your mother left me this letter before she died, and it says something very different. Should I read it to the crowd right now?" His face drained of all its color. "My name is Darnell Crawford. I am 73 years old, and I spent 45 years building a commercial construction empire from the dirt up with my bare, calloused hands. Before I tell you how I dismantled my ungrateful son and his manipulative wife in front of their high society friends, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below." Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who built the table they are eating at. The boardroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Chloe was still on the floor, curled into a pathetic ball of ruined designer fabric and smeared makeup, sobbing into her hands. Terrence was completely paralyzed, staring at the empty space where his biological illusion had just been dragged away in federal handcuffs. My granddaughter Maya stood tall and unwavering behind my chair, a silent guardian of our family true legacy. I looked around the long mahogany table at the 12 executives who helped me build this empire. They were looking at me with absolute, unwavering respect. I had not just reclaimed my throne, I had completely sterilized the infection that was threatening to kill my company. But the surgery was not quite finished. The infection needed to be entirely removed from the premises. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to my attorney, Vincent. Vincent is not a man who gloats. He does not smile when he destroys a career. He executes his duties with the cold mechanical precision of an executioner swinging a very heavy axe. He stepped forward from the shadows near the door, opened his black leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red legal folder. It was the exact same folder Chloe had frantically carried into the downtown police precinct on Friday night. Vincent cleared his throat, addressing the board of directors first. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced, his voice projecting clearly across the massive room. "Please be assured that Crawford Construction is entirely secure. There will be no hostile takeover. There is no medical conservatorship. The fraudulent claims have been neutralized. Furthermore, we have already executed a massive restructuring of the executive hierarchy." Vincent then turned his gaze down to Terrence, who was still kneeling on the carpet looking up with dull, terrified eyes. "Terrence," Vincent said coldly, "I have here the fully notarized and legally binding document you signed in the presence of a police official last Friday night in exchange for your bail funds." Terrence blinked his shattered mind, trying to process the words. He stammered, saying he just signed a standard liability waiver to release the money. He said Chloe told him it was just a corporate formality. "It was not a formality," Vincent stated, pulling the crisp white pages from the red folder and dropping them onto the table right in front of Terrence's face. "You signed a comprehensive, unconditional letter of resignation. You voluntarily relinquished your title as vice president of this company. Furthermore, you legally surrendered all executive decision-making authority directly back to the founder, Darnell Crawford. As of Friday night, you are no longer employed by this corporation in any capacity." Terrence let out a strangled gasp. He reached out with trembling fingers, touching the signature line. It was his own sloppy handwriting. He had signed away his entire career because he was too scared to spend the weekend in a holding cell and too lazy to read the fine print. But Vincent was not done loading the dirt onto the coffin. "Based on your documented attempts to misappropriate corporate funds and your aggressive actions against the founder." Vincent continued relentlessly. "The betrayal clause embedded in Vivian Crawford Trust has been officially triggered and fully executed. Your 20% equity stake in this company has been forcefully devalued to exactly $1 per share. The company treasury completed the automatic buyout this morning at 9 o'clock. The liquidated funds have already been irrevocably transferred to the Inner City Youth Foundation designated by your late mother. You own absolutely nothing here. Your corporate credit cards are permanently canceled. Your access badges are deactivated. Your corporate vehicle has already been repossessed from the dealership parking lot." The sheer magnitude of the financial annihilation hit Terrence like a physical blow to the chest. He was not just fired, he was completely destitute. The millions of dollars he thought were his birthright had evaporated into thin air, given away to the very people his racist social climbing wife constantly looked down upon. Chloe stopped crying for a moment. She lifted her head from the carpet, her face a horrific mask of smeared mascara and pure panic. "The house," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What about our house? We still have our home. We can sell it. We can start over." I finally spoke. I leaned forward in my heavy leather chair, looking down at the two parasites who had tried to bury me alive. "You do not have a home," I said, my voice echoing like thunder in the silent boardroom. Chloe shook her head frantically. She argued that the massive 6-bedroom estate in the gated community belonged to them. She said they had lived there for 10 years. She said she decorated it herself. "You picked out the curtains, Chloe," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper. "But you never bothered to look at the deed. When I bought that property for you a decade ago, I did not put it in your name. I placed it in a blind corporate trust owned entirely by Crawford Construction. I let you live there rent-free. I paid the property taxes. I paid the maintenance fees. I paid the landscaping bills so you could throw your lavish garden parties and impress your terrible friends, but you never owned a single brick of that foundation. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single folded piece of thick legal paper. I tossed it over the edge of the mahogany table. It fluttered down and landed directly between Terrence and Chloe on the floor. "That is an expedited commercial eviction notice," I announced. "Because you are no longer employees of this company, you no longer qualify for corporate housing benefits. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal clothing you can fit into the trunks of the cheap rental cars you will now have to afford. If you are still on my property by this time tomorrow, the local sheriff's department will physically remove you for trespassing." The absolute undeniable reality of their situation finally crushed them. They were broke. They were homeless. They were facing massive legal battles, and they had absolutely no one left to manipulate. Terrence completely snapped. The polished, arrogant executive who had stood on my patio on Saturday holding a beer and mocking my blue-collar roots was entirely gone. He was reduced to a miserable, weeping shell of a human being. He dragged himself across the expensive carpet on his hands and knees. He crawled right up to the side of my chair. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands and grabbed the fabric of my tailored pant leg. He gripped my ankle like a drowning man holding onto the very last piece of driftwood in the ocean. Dad Terrence wailed, his voice tearing through the boardroom in a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "Dad, please. I am so sorry. I made a mistake. I was confused. Richard manipulated me. Chloe manipulated me. I did not mean any of it. Please do not do this to me. I have nothing left. I am your son. Please, Dad. I am your son." He buried his face into my shoe, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for the mercy he had ruthlessly denied me when I was lying on the floor of my study, pretending to die. He thought my heart was still soft enough to save him. He thought the decades of history we shared would act as a shield against the consequences of his absolute evil. I looked down at the top of his head. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing. The space in my heart where my son used to live had completely scarred over. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed his wrists. I peeled his sweaty fingers off my pant leg one by one. I pushed his hands away and smoothly pulled my leg back, creating a hard physical distance between us. Terrence looked up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terror he had never known in his pampered, privileged life. I looked him dead in the eyes, ensuring my words would be burned into his memory for the rest of his miserable existence. At the barbecue on Saturday, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any human warmth. "You stood in front of 50 people, pointed your finger at me, and said I was not your father." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy over his weeping face. "Today I finally agree with you." I turned my chair away from him. I looked up at the two large federal agents standing by the door. "Gentlemen," I said smoothly, "please escort these two trespassers out of my building." The agent stepped forward, grabbing Terrence and Chloe by the arms, dragging them up from the floor. They screamed and pleaded as they were pulled backward out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off their pathetic cries, leaving my empire completely clean, completely silent, and entirely mine. 1 month is a very strange measure of time. In the grand scheme of a 73-year-old life, it is nothing but a fleeting moment. But when you are falling from the very top of the world down to the absolute bottom of the concrete pavement, 1 month feels like an agonizing, endless eternity. Exactly 30 days after the boardroom doors closed on my ungrateful son and his scheming wife, the dust had finally settled. The sensational news articles about the Crawford corporate scandal had slowly faded from the front pages, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard reality of consequence. I was sitting in my study, enjoying a quiet morning with a cup of dark roast coffee, reading the final legal briefs Vincent had sent over. The justice system is notoriously slow, but when you have an ironclad case built on federal wiretaps, forged medical documents, and undeniable financial fraud, the wheels of justice tend to spin with terrifying efficiency. Terrence and Chloe had officially been indicted. They stood before a county judge facing a mountain of felony charges: conspiracy to commit elder exploitation, corporate embezzlement, forgery of legal medical documents, because I had systematically frozen every single legitimate asset and liquidated Terrence shares into the charity trust. They could not afford the high-powered, expensive defense attorneys they thought they deserved. They had to stand in that sterile courtroom flanked by an overworked, underpaid public defender who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for privileged people trying to rob their elders, did not show them a single ounce of mercy. Their passports were seized. Their travel was restricted. They were facing heavy restitution and the very real looming threat of maximum security prison time once the trial concluded. But the legal destruction was only half of their punishment. The financial ruin was the true executioner. The corporate eviction notice I handed them was perfectly enforced. They were physically escorted out of their 6-bedroom mansion in the gated community. They were forced to leave behind the custom furniture, the imported art, and the luxury lifestyle they had built using my stolen money. Because of the frozen accounts and the massive million-dollar debt Terrence had foolishly co-signed for the federal fugitive Richard Sterling, their credit scores plummeted into the abyss. No respectable landlord in the city would even look at their applications. They ended up exactly where they belonged. They were forced to move into the Starlight Motel, a decaying, roach-infested building sitting right on the edge of the interstate highway. It was the kind of place where the neon sign always flickered. The carpet smelled like stale cigarette smoke and desperation, and the police sirens provided a constant midnight lullaby. My private investigator kept me updated on their miserable situation. The transition from Egyptian cotton sheets to stained, lumpy motel mattresses completely broke whatever fragile bond they had left. When the money vanished, the illusion of their grand aristocratic romance vanished right along with it. Chloe is a creature of comfort and status. She did not marry Terrence for love. She married him for the Crawford Empire. Once she realized that the empire was permanently locked behind a fortress, I controlled her survival instincts kicked in. A parasite cannot survive on a dead host. The investigator reported that the screaming matches in their cramped motel room could be heard by everyone in the parking lot. Chloe blamed Terrence for being too stupid to secure the funds before the barbecue. She blamed him for trusting Richard. She blamed him for getting caught. Terrence, whose entire identity was built on his fragile ego, completely crumbled under her vicious attacks. Exactly 3 weeks into their motel exile, Chloe finally made her ultimate move. She did not stand by her man in his darkest hour. She packed her 2 remaining designer suitcases, the ones the federal authorities had not managed to seize, and she walked out the door. She left a set of quickly drafted divorce papers sitting on the cheap sticky laminate table next to the motel television. She did not leave to go find a job or support herself. She had already found a new host. She climbed into the passenger seat of a leased silver BMW driven by some mid-level regional sales manager who had a decent credit score and absolutely no idea about the toxic venom he was inviting into his life. She drove away without looking back, completely abandoning Terrence to face the crushing legal debt and the criminal charges entirely alone. Terrence was left sitting in a dark, humid motel room. He had no wife, he had no father, he had no fake aristocratic bloodline to claim. He had absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a court date that would likely end his freedom. A few days after Chloe abandoned him, I had to travel across town to sign some final municipal permits for a new construction site. I was sitting in the back of my black town car. My driver was navigating through the heavy afternoon traffic, taking a route that happened to pass through the lower east side of the city. As we approached a rundown intersection, I told the driver to pull over into the parking lot of a local dilapidated corner convenience store. I did not want to buy anything. I just wanted to observe. Through the heavily tinted bulletproof glass of my vehicle, I saw a man walking out of the store. He was wearing a faded, wrinkled gray hoodie and a pair of dirty sweatpants. His shoulders were slumped forward, completely devoid of the arrogant, chest-puffed posture he used to carry around my boardroom. His hair was unkempt, and he looked like he had aged 20 years in a single month. It was Terrence. I watched him stand outside the glass doors of the convenience store. He was holding a small plastic grocery bag containing a single loaf of cheap white bread and a generic brand can of soup. He stopped on the cracked concrete sidewalk and reached into his pockets. I watched the man who used to confidently throw down my corporate black card to buy $100,000 sports cars. I watched him pull a handful of loose change from his sweatpants. He stood there carefully counting the pennies, nickels, and dimes in the palm of his hand, trying to see if he had enough left over to go back inside and buy a cheap bottle of water. He looked exhausted. He looked broken. He looked like a man who finally understood the exact price of his own greed. I sat in the quiet, climate-controlled comfort of my car. I watched the boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my youth to protect, scraping together literal pennies on a dirty sidewalk. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the moment he pointed his finger at me and proudly declared that I was not his father. I thought about the absolute disgust in his eyes when he looked at my rough working-class hands. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I did not smile at his misery. But I also did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not shed a tear for the hungry, broken man standing on the corner. The universe has a very strict accounting system, and the ledger had finally been balanced. He made his choices, and now he was simply paying the bill. I tapped the dark glass, separating the passenger cabin from the front seat. I quietly told my driver to put the car in gear and take me home. The heavy engine hummed to life, and the town car smoothly pulled out of the parking lot, merging back into the busy city traffic. I did not look back out the window as we drove away. I left Terrence standing on the corner counting his pennies, completely erased from my world forever.